Wade Calloway had not held a woman's wrist in 4 years. The last time he was checking for a pulse that wasn't there anymore, and he had not let himself think about that morning since. So, when his hand closed around the wrist of the woman lying face down in the straw of his old storage barn outside Harlow Creek, Nevada, on a Thursday in August of 1878, and he felt the flutter faint wrong, but there's something moved in his chest that he had no name for, and no use for, and absolutely no time for right now. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Caroline's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Wade had not planned to stop at the barn that morning. He had 3 horses to shoe before noon, a mail delivery to organize for the Tuesday rider, and a conversation he'd been putting off for 2 weeks with his property manager about the north fence line that was costing him money every time a steer pushed through it. He had a full morning and a longer afternoon and exactly 0 room in either one for complications. He stopped because of the mare. Old Agnes, a gray quarter horse he'd been keeping in semi-retirement since she threw a shoe and cracked her hoof 6 months back, had been stabled in the secondary barn at the edge of his property since May. He checked on her every few days. It was Tuesday. He was already a day late. He heard it before he got the door open. Not a voice, not exactly. Not. More like the idea of a voice. Something that had been a sound once, and had worn itself down to almost nothing, trying to get through wood and heat and the particular silence of a barn in August. He stood with his hand on the latch and listened, and the sound came again, and his jaw tightened. He pulled the door. The smell hit him first. Blood and summer heat, and something sour underneath that, told him whatever had happened in here had not happened recently enough. He moved fast down the length of the barn, past Agnes, who stamped and tossed her head past the feed line to the far corner where the straw was old, and the light came in thin through a gap in the boards. She was lying on her side, her dark blue dress so dark with dried blood at the shoulder that he almost didn't see where the injury was until he crouched down beside her. 30-something. Dark hair half pulled from its pins fanned out across the straw. Skin pale as chalk, which on a fair-skinned woman meant something worse than pale. Her right hand was still closed around something, a leather strap and edge of something flat, something she had not let go of, even in whatever had passed for unconsciousness out here in this heat. He put his fingers on her wrist. Flutter. Faint. Wrong. There. Ma'am. He kept his voice low the way you keep your voice low around animals in pain. Ma'am, can you hear me? Her eyes opened. Gray eyes. Fever bright and exhausted at the same time, the way eyes get when a body has been fighting for too long without backup. They found his face and stayed there. You're real, she said. Her voice was barely a scrape of sound. I'm real. He was already assessing shoulder wound, possibly a cracked rib, from the way she was positioned. Dehydration that had been going on for at least a day, maybe 2. How long have you been in here? A long pause. She was thinking hard about something, and it wasn't the question he'd asked. Don't, she said. Don't take it. He looked at her hand. The leather strap was attached to a satchel flat canvas back, the kind a bookkeeper or a clerk might carry. She had it tucked against her body like a second rib. I'm not going to take it, he said. I'm going to get you out of here. Can you tell me your name? Another pause. Deciding. Caroline, she said. Caroline Aldridge. He knew the name. Everybody in Harlow Creek knew the name the way you know the names attached to recent trouble. Douglas Aldridge's widow. Douglas, who had worked 6 years as an accounts clerk at the Carson Commercial Bank before he went out to check a mine shaft collapse 8 months ago and didn't come back. The accident had been ruled unfortunate and inevitable. 2 other men had died the same day. Nobody had looked twice at the paperwork. Wade looked at the satchel pressed against her ribs. Mrs. Aldridge, he said. I need to pick you up. All right. She looked at him for a moment, the measuring kind of look. He understood what she was measuring, whether he was safe, and he understood she had no particular reason to conclude that he was, and he waited, because rushing a frightened, injured woman into a decision she wasn't ready to make was not how he operated. "All right," she said. He lifted her carefully. She was too light. That landed somewhere behind his sternum in a way he didn't have time to examine. She made one small sound when he moved her shoulders sharp and quickly controlled, and then she was quiet, the satchel still pressed between them, still in her grip. He carried her to his horse. "Harlan Cross," she said when they were halfway across the yard. Her voice was steadier now, or she was making it steadier. "Do you know who he is?" "I know who he is. He had me followed. 2 men. A pause. "They took my horse and my bag. They didn't take the ledger because they didn't know I'd moved it." A beat. "I moved it 3 days ago, into the satchel, before they came." Wade looked down at her. "You knew they were coming." "I suspected." She met his eyes. "I've been a bookkeeper for 12 years, Mr. Calloway. Wade Calloway." Something moved in her expression. Recognition. "The Pinkerton. Former. They say you left because you wouldn't help the railroad push out of town. People say a lot of things." She looked at him steadily, even pale and hurting, even draped across a stranger's arms in a barnyard in August. "Is it true?" He didn't answer that. He got her onto his horse instead, settled her, carefully swung up behind her, and kept one arm across her to hold her upright. She leaned back just slightly, just enough to tell him she'd made her decision about him, and he pressed his horse forward and rode toward Doc Pruitt's office in town. She didn't speak again for a while. He didn't push. Then, "The ledger," she said. "I need you to understand what's in it before anyone else sees it." "Tell me." "Not yet." Her voice had gone careful. "I need to know you won't hand it to the sheriff." He considered that. "Why not the sheriff?" "Because Sheriff Dodd drinks with Harlan Cross every Friday evening at the Golden Spur." A pause. "I've been watching Cross's operation for 8 months. I know who he meets with. I know who he pays. I know which judge signed which order and what he received for it." She stopped. "My husband kept records. He thought he was protecting himself. He thought if anything happened to him, the records would protect me. They didn't." "They will," she said, "if I can get them in front of the right person." Wade said nothing to that. He was running names through his mind the way he used to run files quickly from memory, cross-referencing. Harlan Cross, Carson Commercial Bank. 3 foreclosures last spring on homesteads along the northern corridor. 5 land transfers in 6 months, all at prices that made no sense unless you knew something about that corridor that the sellers didn't. He knew. He'd done the math himself 6 weeks ago, and then set it aside because it was not his business, and he had made a decision after Missouri, after Sarah, after the railroad job that had ended his career, and a piece of his conscience simultaneously, that other people's battles were not his to fight anymore. He was reconsidering that decision. Doc Pruitt was a small, irritable man of 65 who had been irritable for so long it had become a form of efficiency. He took one look at Caroline and said, "In here," and didn't ask unnecessary questions until he'd done the necessary work. Wade waited in the hall. He stood with his hat in his hands and listened to the low sound of Doc Pruitt's voice and Caroline's, which was steadier than it should have been for a woman in her condition, and he was aware, the way you're aware of something shifting in foundation, that the morning had become something other than what it had started as. He pulled out his pocket watch, 9:47. He had horses to shoe. He put the watch away. The door opened at 10:30. Doc Pruitt came out and closed it behind him and looked at Wade with the expression of a man who has just finished being angry and is now moving into something colder. "Shoulder wound is a knife cut not deep, but it needed cleaning. 2 cracked ribs not broken. Dehydration significant. She has a fever that's been going on for at least 36 hours. He paused. "She's been in that barn since Sunday, Mr. Calloway." Sunday. Today was Tuesday. 2 days in August, heat with a knife wound and cracked ribs and no water. Doc Pruitt's voice was flat. She kept herself alive by staying still. She told me she rationed what little moisture she had, that she'd been trained not to panic by 12 years of keeping accounts where panic meant mistakes. He looked at Wade. She's either very disciplined or very frightened. Possibly both. She needs to stay here. At minimum 2 days. The fever needs to break. The ribs need to be wrapped properly and left alone. Doc Pruitt crossed his arms. Wade, who did this to her? A pause. She'll tell you what she wants you to know, Wade said. It's her business to tell. Pruitt gave him a long look. You're not going to let it sit at that. No, Wade agreed. I'm not. He went back in. Caroline was lying in the examination bed with a cleaner look about her, the blood gone. The shoulder dressed her dark hair smooth again in a rough braid that she must have done herself because it had the particular imprecision of someone doing their own hair without a mirror. The satchel was on the bed beside her, still in reach. She saw his eyes go to it. I want to tell you what's in it, she said, before you decide whether to get involved. He pulled the chair to the bedside and sat down. Tell me. She told him. It took 40 minutes. She was precise and methodical, not because she was unemotional about it. He could see the emotion, controlled and contained under the surface of her voice, the way water is contained under ice, but because she had organized this information in her head over 8 months of careful watching, and she delivered it that way. In order. With evidence. Harlan Cross had been operating a land acquisition scheme for 3 years. The mechanism was elegant in the way that truly dangerous things are elegant, simple at its core, complicated in its execution. He issued loans through the Carson Commercial Bank at rates that appeared reasonable. He attached conditions to those loans, small conditions buried in the language that allowed the bank to reassess the property valuation at specific intervals. When the reassessment came, the valuation dropped. The loan was called. The borrower couldn't pay. The bank foreclosed. Cross acquired the land for roughly a third of its actual value. 11 families in 3 years, most of them homesteaders, a few of them small ranchers, none of them with enough legal knowledge to understand what the paperwork actually said. The Northern Corridor, Wade said. She looked at him. You know about it. I suspected. The foreclosures were too neat, too timed. He leaned forward. There's a railroad survey. There's a railroad survey, she confirmed. The Pacific Northern Line. They've been looking at a route through the Northern Valley for 2 years. If the line goes through where the survey indicates... She stopped. The land Cross has acquired sits directly in the right-of-way. All 11 parcels. He'll sell it to the railroad at market rate for railroad corridor land, which is 8 to 10 times what he paid for it. Conservative estimate. She looked at him steadily. My husband worked in that bank for 6 years. He kept copies of every document that crossed his desk. He thought the copies were insurance. He thought if anything happened to him... Her voice didn't break, but she steadied it carefully, the way you steady a lamp in wind. He thought the copies would protect me. He hid them in the bottom of his work case. He told me once, just once, that there was something in his case that he hoped I'd never need to understand. When did you find them? 2 weeks after the funeral. She looked at her hands. It took me 3 months to understand what I was looking at. It took me another 4 months to verify it against the public land records. It took me 1 more month to build the case into something a judge couldn't dismiss. A pause. And then someone told Harlan Cross that Douglas Aldridge's widow had been spending a great deal of time in the land records office. And he sent 2 men, last Sunday morning. Her jaw tightened. They broke my door at dawn. They took what they could find. They were very thorough. A beat. They didn't find the ledger because I'd moved it Thursday when I started to feel like I was being watched. I put it in my work satchel and took it with me everywhere. She looked at the satchel beside her. They took my horse. They took my house key. One of them hit me twice before I fell, and then they put me in a wagon and drove me out to your barn and left me there. She said this plainly, not performing it, just stating it the way you state facts you've been carrying long enough that they've lost their power to shock you, even though they haven't lost their weight. They thought I'd die, she said. Or they thought that even if I didn't, a woman alone without a horse or a key or a way back to town was not going to be anyone's problem. Wade was quiet for a moment. Who knows you're missing? He asked. Ruth McAllister. She runs the dry goods store. She was Douglas's cousin. We're not close, but she... Caroline stopped. She knows I wouldn't leave without telling her. Ruth McAllister, Wade said. All right. What does that mean? It means I'm going to go see Ruth McAllister. He stood up, picked up his hat. And it means I'm going to ask Doc Pruitt to tell anyone who comes asking that he hasn't seen you. Caroline looked at him. You're getting involved. He put his hat on. Seems like. She looked at him for a long moment. The measuring look again more sustained, this time more searching. You don't know me, she said. You came in to check on a horse. I came in to check on a horse, he agreed. He looked at her directly. I found something else. A pause. Why? She said. Truly, what is it to you? He turned his hat in his hands once. He had not answered that question for anyone in 4 years. He was not entirely sure he could answer it now, not cleanly, not without getting into territory he kept banked up and sealed off. But she had asked it directly, and she deserved a direct answer, not a deflection. I used to work for people who had all the papers, he said. All the legal authority, and all the right signatures and every document in the right order. And I helped them for 6 years. Because the papers said they were right. He set his hat on his head. I watched a town of 200 people get run off their land because the papers said it was legal. Watched families lose everything they'd built because the papers were in order. He looked at her. I walked away after that. I told myself that wasn't my business anymore. Other people's fights. Caroline waited. You're lying in a doc's bed with cracked ribs and a knife cut, Wade said, because a man with all the right papers decided you were inconvenient, and you're still holding on to that satchel. He paused. That makes it my business. She absorbed that. He has reach, she said. Cross. He has the sheriff. He has 2 judges that I know of. He has men who will do what Sunday morning was. I know. And you're one person. I know, he said. I've got a few advantages he doesn't know about yet. She looked at him. Such as, he doesn't know what I know about that railroad survey. He doesn't know I spent 3 years in the Pinkerton service building cases that went to territorial court, and I know every procedural move his lawyers are going to make before they make them. He paused. And he doesn't know I'm involved, which is the most useful thing I've got right now. Caroline looked at the satchel. Then she looked back at Wade. There's a woman, she said. Her name is Nora Pelham. She lost her homestead in the second round of foreclosures 18 months ago. She and her 2 daughters are living above the laundry on Cutter Street. She kept her eyes on his face. She's one of 11. If we're going to do this, you should know them. The 11 families. They're not abstractions in a ledger. They're people. Tell me their names, Wade said. She told him all 11. He listened to every one. He didn't write them down. He didn't need to. He had always had a particular memory for names attached to injustice. It was the one thing from his Pinkerton years he'd kept without trying. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. There's one more thing, Caroline said. Her voice had gone careful in a different way. The way it goes when you're about to say the most important thing, not the most dramatic one. My husband left a second ledger, she said. Not the one in the satchel, a different one, personal. His own record of what he suspected month by month for the last year he worked at that bank. He didn't understand everything he was recording. Some of it he coded. He was cautious by nature, Douglas. But I've been reading his handwriting for 12 years. She looked at Wade steadily. I know what the code means. And what it says is that Harlan Cross didn't just fraud 11 homesteaders. He arranged my husband's accident. The room went very still. The mineshaft collapse, Wade said slowly, was not an accident. Her voice was level. Absolutely level. Douglas found something in the bank's accounts that he wasn't supposed to find. He told Cross he had questions. 3 weeks later, he went to inspect a mine shaft on behalf of the bank's loan portfolio, and the shaft collapsed. She held Wade's gaze. 2 other men died. They were both men Douglas had told about his questions. Wade stood with that for a moment. He thought about Sarah. He thought about sitting across a desk from a railroad superintendent who had documents and lawyers, and the kind of patient, smooth certainty that comes from never having been held accountable for anything. He thought about a town called Millbrook, Missouri, and 200 people with nowhere to go. "Where's the second ledger?" he said. "Hidden," Caroline said. "Somewhere Cross doesn't know about. I'll tell you when I trust you completely." He looked at her. "You don't trust me completely yet." "Mr. Calloway," she said, and there was something almost dry in her voice, something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "I have been a bookkeeper for 12 years. I verify everything twice before I commit to it." A pause. "You found me this morning. Give me until tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment. Then he gave a single nod. "All right." He picked up the satchel from the bed and held it out to her, making sure she could see he was giving it to her, not taking it. She took it and settled it against her side, and some of the particular tightness around her eyes eased by a fraction. "I'll speak to Ruth McAllister," he said, "and I'll come back this evening." "Don't come through the front of the building," she said. "Cross has a man who watches the street." He paused. "You've noticed him." "I notice everything," she said simply. "It's how I'm still alive." He left through Doc Pruitt's back door, which he'd used before, and which opened onto the alley behind Merchant Row. And he stood in the alley for a moment, with the August heat pressing down on him from above, and the sound of the town going about its business all around him. And he thought about 11 names, and a second ledger, and a woman who had been lying in his barn for 2 days, still holding on to the one thing she'd managed to save. Harlan Cross was sitting in his bank right now. Wade knew that, behind a desk with his papers, and his judges, and his smooth, patient certainty. Sitting there with the particular confidence of a man who has never had his plans disrupted in any meaningful way. Wade walked toward Ruth McAllister's dry goods store with his hat low, and his mind running through every case he'd ever built, every procedural weakness he'd ever found in a man who thought his paperwork made him untouchable. He had a lot of work to do before evening. Upstairs in Doc Pruitt's examination room, Caroline Aldridge lay with the satchel against her ribs and her eyes on the ceiling, and allowed herself for the first time in 8 months to breathe without counting the cost of it. A man she didn't know had carried her out of that barn and listened to all 11 names without looking away once. Her husband had believed in documentation, in records, in the idea that truth properly organized and clearly presented could protect the people who carried it. She was beginning to believe that too again for the first time since a mine shaft collapsed on a Tuesday morning and took Douglas and her certainty of the world with it. Outside her window, the town of Harlow Creek, Nevada, went on the way towns do, indifferent, ordinary, and entirely unaware that the books were about to be opened. The numbers were about to be read out loud, and the man who had been running this county from behind a bank desk for 3 years was about to discover what a woman with 12 years of bookkeeping experience and nothing left to lose was capable of accounting for. Ruth McAllister was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry when Wade told her. She stood behind her counter with her hands flat on the wood and her jaw set, and her eyes doing something complicated that was not crying but was in the same territory, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said anything at all. "Sunday," she said. "She's been out there since Sunday. She's at Doc Pruitt's now. She's going to be all right." "She's going to be all right," Ruth repeated. And the way she said it made clear she was not agreeing with him. She was filing the phrase away, to be angry about later when there was time for anger. Right now, she was doing something more useful. Who knows she's there? Just Pruitt and me. I need it to stay that way. Ruth looked at him. She was 60-something, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now something better, the kind of face that had been tested and had held. She'd run this store for 20 years since her husband passed, and she'd done it without asking for help or permission, and she had the particular quality of a woman who has learned to read a room very fast because she couldn't afford not to. "Harlan Cross," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She was quiet again. Then she reached under her counter and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote something down and folded it and held it out to him. "That's the name and address of the woman who was foreclosed on last March," she said. "Edna Birch. She lost 40 acres of good valley land, and she's living in 2 rooms on the edge of town with her son, who is 16 and doing whatever work he can find." She held the paper steady. "She's not the only one, Mr. Calloway. There are 10 families in this county that have had their land walked out from under them in 3 years, and everyone in this town knows it, and nobody has said a word above a whisper because nobody wants to end up the same way." Wade took the paper. "Caroline has documentation," he said. "Caroline has been working on this for 8 months." Ruth's voice was flat. "I knew what she was doing. She told me some of it. Not all." A pause. "I told her she was going to get herself killed. She told me she was going to get it done first." Ruth looked at the window. "She almost got killed." "Almost," Wade agreed. "But she still got the ledger." Ruth turned back to him. Something shifted in her expression. Something that was older and harder, and more determined than grief. "What do you need?" she said. "Right now I need you to act like you haven't seen me, and you don't know where Caroline is. If anyone asks, she mentioned she might visit her sister in Reno." "She doesn't have a sister in Reno. Nobody who'd ask knows that." Ruth gave him a long look, then she nodded once. "And after right now, I'll come back when I know more." He picked up his hat from the counter. "Mrs. McAllister, the man Cross has watching Doc Pruitt's front door. Do you know who he is?" She looked out her window at the street without moving her head very slightly, the practiced non-look of someone who'd been watching people for 20 years without wanting them to know it. "Billy Crane," she said. "He does odd work for the bank, mostly the kind that doesn't get written down." She paused. "He drinks at the Golden Spur from 4 o'clock on, every day without exception." Wade put his hat on. "Thank you." "Mr. Calloway." Her voice caught him at the door. Douglas Aldridge was a good man. He was scared, and he didn't know what to do with what he found, and he made some wrong choices about who to trust, and it cost him everything. She held his gaze. "Caroline is not scared. She knows exactly what to do. She just needs someone to stand beside her while she does it." He went out. The walk back across town was exactly long enough for him to think through what came next, which was a list of problems in order of urgency. First, Billy Crane could not be the only set of eyes Cross had on the situation. A man who arranged Sunday morning had already decided that Caroline was a loose end, which meant he would want confirmation she was dead or gone. And when that confirmation didn't come, he would start looking harder. Second, the ledger in the satchel was evidence, but it was not yet a case. Evidence needed a venue, and every venue Wade could think of in this county had been compromised in one way or another by Cross's careful years of relationship building. Third, the second ledger, the one Caroline hadn't told him the location of yet, was either the thing that broke this case open or the thing that got both of them killed before they could break it, and he needed to know which before he could plan properly. He was a man who had built cases for 6 years. He knew what a solid case looked like, and he knew what this one still needed, and he was doing the arithmetic on it when he came around the corner of Merchant Row and nearly walked directly into Harlan Cross. Cross was not alone. He had a younger man with him, early 30s. Expensive hat, the relaxed posture of someone who works for a man with money and has absorbed some of the comfort of it. They were coming out of the land office. Cross had a folder under his arm, and he was talking in a low, easy voice to the younger man, and he did not see Wade until Wade was 6 feet away, and then he looked up, and his face did the thing that smooth faces do when they're surprised. It went briefly fractionally blank before the warmth came back. "Calloway," he said. "Don't see you in this part of town usually." "Bank business," Wade said, which was not a lie exactly. He kept his voice easy. "You. Same." Cross glanced down at the folder. Property transfers, never-ending business in a growing county. He had the politician's voice warm, slightly too warm, the kind of warm that has been calibrated to feel genuine. "How's the station doing? Heard you had some trouble with the north fence." "Managing," Wade said. They looked at each other for a moment. Two men in a street, neither one showing anything useful. "You hear anything about that Aldridge woman?" Cross said, pleasantly, conversationally. "The way you mentioned something you've been thinking about that has nothing to do with anything." "Heard she left town unexpectedly. People were a little surprised." "Can't say I know her well," Wade said. "Saw her at the McAllister store a few times. Seemed quiet." Cross nodded. "Grief does that. Terrible thing, losing a husband that way." He tucked the folder more firmly under his arm. "Well, good to see you, Calloway." "Likewise," Wade said. He kept walking. He did not look back. He counted to 30 before he allowed himself to assess what had just happened, which was that Harlan Cross had just told him two things without meaning to. First, that he didn't know where Caroline was and was actively fishing for information, and second, that he was concerned enough about it to ask a man he didn't particularly know in the middle of the street, which meant he was rattled enough to make small mistakes. Rattled men made larger mistakes given enough pressure. Wade went back to his station, finished the 3 horses he'd promised before noon, organized the Tuesday rider's mail, and had a conversation with his property manager about the north fence that he got through in 12 minutes flat by simply agreeing to every suggested solution. Then he sent his 2 station hands on the overnight supply run to Carson City that he'd been putting off for a week, which got them off the property until Thursday and simplified his evening considerably. He ate something standing at his kitchen counter, which he'd been doing since Sarah died, because sitting at a table alone had a particular quality he hadn't been able to make peace with. At 5:30, he went out the back way and came into Doc Pruitt's through the alley entrance. Caroline was sitting up in the examination bed. The fever had come down some, he could see it in the color in her face, less chalk, more like a person. She had the satchel open on her lap and papers spread across the blanket in front of her, and she was looking at them with the focused, unsentimental attention of someone doing work they have done many times before. She heard him come in and looked up, and some of the focus shifted. "You ran into someone," she said. He stopped. "How did you know?" "Your hat." She nodded at it. "You put it on tighter when something happened. Douglas used to do the same thing." She folded the paper she was holding. "Who?" "Cross himself." He sat down in the chair. "Coming out of the land office. He asked about you. Casually. Said he'd heard you left town." She was quiet for a moment. "He's still trying to establish a story before anyone notices I'm missing." "That's what I thought. Which means we have a window before he starts looking harder." He looked at the papers spread across the blanket. "You feel well enough to work?" "I've been working for the last 3 hours." She said it without defensiveness, just matter-of-factly. "Doc Pruitt brought me the land records I asked for from his son-in-law at the county office. I've been cross-referencing them against the satchel ledger." She looked down at the papers. "Wade." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed. "There's a 12th family," she said. He went still. "You said 11. "I found 11 from the bank records, but the land records show a 12th transfer, a parcel on the eastern edge of the valley. 48 acres. Transferred 8 months ago, 2 weeks after Douglas died." She looked up. "The name on the original deed is Harlan Cross. The transfer is to a holding company in San Francisco. The same holding company that owns the Pacific Northern Line." A beat of silence. He already sold one parcel directly to the railroad, Wade said slowly. Which means he's further along than I thought. The survey isn't theoretical. There's already a transaction. She gathered the papers, carefully organizing them into an order that clearly made sense to her. If that transaction is on record in San Francisco, it connects Cross to the railroad explicitly. That's not fraud within the county court system, that's a federal matter. Wade looked at her. You know someone in the federal system, she said. It was not a question. I know a U.S. Marshal in Carson City, he said. Name's Henry Briggs. I worked 2 cases with him in my Pinkerton years. He's honest, which is unusual, and he doesn't like railroads, which is rarer. He paused. He's also the kind of man who needs to see a complete case before he moves, not pieces. A complete case. Then we build him a complete case, Caroline said. She said it the way she said most things, simply as a statement of what was going to happen. Caroline. He leaned forward. There's still the matter of the second ledger. She looked at him for a long moment. The measuring look sustained careful. He let her measure. He understood now that this was not distrust. Exactly, it was the habit of a woman who had been carrying something this heavy alone for 8 months, and had learned that the only way to survive was to verify everything twice before she committed to it. Douglas hid it, she said finally, in the place he was most afraid of. Wade waited. The bank, she said. There's a storage room on the lower level of the Carson Commercial Bank where old loan files are kept. Douglas had a private cabinet in that room, small wooden, with a lock he'd brought from home, because the bank didn't provide them for junior clerks. He told me about it once 2 years before he died. He said it was where he kept things he didn't want anyone to find. She kept her eyes on Wade. I believe the second ledger is still in that cabinet. Cross doesn't know about the cabinet because Douglas never told him and nobody else knew it existed. Wade absorbed this. You want me to get into the Carson Commercial Bank's storage room, he said. I want us to figure out how to get the ledger out of there without Cross knowing it's gone, she said. There's a difference. That's still breaking into a bank. You were a Pinkerton detective for 6 years. You've done more complicated things than that, I'd wager. He looked at her. Something moved in his chest that he didn't examine closely. It was something like being seen, which was a thing he hadn't felt in a long time, and wasn't sure what to do with now that it was here. The bank closes at 6, he said. Cross has a dinner meeting every Wednesday with the county commissioner. Ruth told me he never misses it. That gives us a window tomorrow night. Us, she said. You know what the cabinet looks like and where it is. I know how to move through a building without being noticed. He held her gaze. Neither of us can do it alone. She looked at him for a long moment. My ribs are cracked. I know. Doc Pruitt is going to tell me I'm not ready to walk across town and into a bank. He probably is, Wade agreed. She looked down at her papers. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her running through it, the same way he ran through it the risks, the alternatives, the variables that couldn't be controlled. She was not reckless. She was methodical. She would think it all the way through before she decided. There's something else, she said without looking up. Something I haven't told you yet. He waited. The night before Douglas died. She said he came home late. He'd been at the bank working through some files Cross had asked him to prepare. He came in and he sat at the kitchen table, and he didn't speak for a long time, and I knew enough to let him sit. She smoothed the edge of a paper with her thumb. Finally, he said, Caroline, if anything happens to me, you find the cabinet and you read what's inside, and you don't show it to anyone in this county until you find someone who is outside Cross's reach. She paused. And then he said, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I thought I was just keeping books. The room was quiet. He was just keeping books, Wade said carefully. He was just keeping books, she agreed. And then he started to understand what the books were recording, and he kept better books. and it cost him everything. Her voice stayed level, but her hand tightened on the edge of the paper. I need you to understand something, Wade. This is not about the money or the land anymore. It hasn't been since the day I found those copies in his work case. She looked up. This is about 11 families who lost what they built, and about 2 men who died in a mine shaft because they asked the wrong questions, and about my husband who thought he was just keeping books. He held her gaze. I understand. Then you understand why I can't let it sit, she said. Not for one more day than necessary. Not for one more night. I understand, he said again, and he meant it differently this time, not as agreement, but as recognition. The particular recognition of a person who has made a choice that cost them everything and has found unexpectedly someone who made a similar choice once and understands the weight of it. He stood up. He picked up his hat. Tomorrow evening, he said. I'll come by at 4 o'clock. That gives us time to plan the route before the bank closes. She nodded once. Then, Wade. He stopped. Cross is going to know it was us, she said. When the ledger is gone, he's going to know. And a man who arranged a mine shaft collapse and left a woman in a barn in August does not respond by filing paperwork. I know, he said. You know what you're stepping into. I know what I'm stepping into. He looked at her steadily. Mrs. Aldridge, I spent 6 years working for people who had all the right papers, and I spent 4 years after that trying to convince myself that walking away from the next wrong thing was a form of wisdom. He turned his hat once in his hands. It wasn't wisdom. It was just easier. She held his gaze. Tomorrow at 4, he said. He went out the back way and into the alley and stood in the early evening air, with the town settling into its nighttime rhythms around him, and he thought about Douglas Aldridge, sitting at a kitchen table saying, I thought I was just keeping books. And he thought about 11 families and 2 dead men and a woman who had been lying in his barn for 2 days, still holding on to the one thing she'd refused to let go of. Somewhere across town, Harlan Cross was sitting down to dinner with the county commissioner, charming and patient, and entirely certain that the problem he'd created on Sunday morning had resolved itself the way problems usually resolve themselves when you applied the right kind of pressure. He was about to find out that he'd miscalculated. And Wade Calloway, walking back through the alley toward his station with his hat pulled low and his mind running through every door and corridor and lock he'd studied in 6 years of Pinkerton work, was already planning exactly how. Doc Pruitt said exactly what Caroline had predicted he would say, which was that she was not ready to walk across town and into a bank. And he said it with the particular irritability of a man who already knows he's going to lose the argument and is angry about it in advance. 2 cracked ribs, he said, a shoulder wound that is 3 days old, a fever that broke last night but has not been gone long enough for me to trust it. He looked at Caroline, and then at Wade, and then back at Caroline. You're going to do it anyway. I need the ledger, Caroline said. Without it, everything else is circumstantial. Without it, you're also alive. Doc Pruitt set down the cloth he'd been holding and crossed his arms. Which seems like a relevant consideration. I've been alive for 8 months with this information, and it hasn't protected me yet, Caroline said. Not sharply, just accurately the way she said most things. The only thing that protects me now is finishing this. Pruitt looked at Wade. Don't look at me, Wade said. I stopped arguing with her at 4:15. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then he went to his cabinet and came back with a length of cloth and began wrapping her ribs with the efficient, slightly aggressive movements of a man who is helping with something he disapproves of. You move slowly, he said. You don't reach above shoulder height. If anything tears open, you stop immediately, regardless of where you are or what you're in the middle of. He tied the wrap off. And you come back here when it's done. Both of you. I'll be up. Caroline put her hand briefly on his arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They went out the back at 6:15 when the light was low enough to be useful, and Billy Crane was 20 minutes into his daily appointment at the Golden Spur. Wade had timed the walk twice that afternoon, 7 minutes from Pruitt's back door to the service alley behind the Carson Commercial Bank. If they moved at Caroline's pace, which was slower than his, but steadier than he'd expected from a woman with cracked ribs and a 3-day-old knife wound. She didn't complain once. She moved carefully and deliberately, and she kept her breathing even in the controlled way of someone who has decided that pain is information but not instruction, and Wade found himself adjusting his own pace to match hers without thinking about it, the way you adjust to the person beside you when you've decided they matter. "The service entrance," she said quietly when they reached the alley. "Douglas mentioned it once. The bank uses it for coal deliveries in winter. It should have a simple bar lock, nothing more." Wade looked at the door. Bar lock, as she'd said. He'd brought a thin iron bar of his own, which he worked through the gap at the doorframe with the particular patience of someone who had done this before, in circumstances considerably more high stakes than a closed bank in Nevada. The bar lifted. The door opened. They went in. The lower level smelled of old paper and coal dust, and the particular dry closeness of a room that doesn't get enough air. Caroline moved beside him without hesitation, which told him she'd been carrying the map of this place in her head for long enough that it felt like memory. "Left," she said softly. "Past the first row of shelves. The storage room is at the end." The storage room door was unlocked, which made sense. You didn't lock the room that held 8-year-old loan files unless you thought someone was going to want them, and Harlan Cross had clearly never imagined that anyone would. He was wrong about that too. Caroline went directly to the back left corner where 3 wooden cabinets stood against the wall. The first 2 were the bank's standard issue, heavy and institutional. The third was smaller and slightly different in construction, homemade, almost assembled from better quality wood than the others, with a lock on it that was clearly not original to the bank. She put her hand on it. "This is it," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "This is Douglas's." She reached into the satchel and produced a small key on a plain ring, the kind a person keeps at the bottom of a bag. For so long it becomes invisible. She'd had it all along, Wade realized. She'd known exactly where the ledger was, and she'd held the key to it for 8 months, waiting for the moment when she had someone she trusted enough to come here with. The lock turned. Inside the cabinet were 3 things: a stack of folded letters bound with twine, a small photograph of Caroline that Douglas must have kept at work, and a flat brown ledger thicker than the one in the satchel with a piece of paper folded inside the front cover. Caroline took out the ledger. She opened it to the first page, and she read the first line, and whatever she read made her close her eyes for exactly 3 seconds before she opened them again. "He wrote it in plain language," she said. "No code. He must have, toward the end, he must have decided that clarity mattered more than concealment." She looked at Wade. "He names Cross directly. He names the dates. He names the mine shaft inspection, and the reason for it, and the conversation he had with Cross 4 days before he went out there." She turned a page. "He names the other 2 men who died. He names what they knew." Wade took the ledger gently from her hands and looked at the page she was on. Douglas Aldridge's handwriting was small and careful, the handwriting of a man trained to precision. The entries were dated. The language was exact. It read, not like a diary, but like testimony, like a man who had understood somewhere in those last weeks that he was writing something that might need to be read in a courtroom. "He knew," Wade said. "By the end. He knew what was coming." "He knew," Caroline said quietly. "And he couldn't figure out how to stop it. He wasn't. Douglas was not a man built for confrontation. He was built for records, for getting things right on paper." She took the ledger back and held it against her chest. He got this right. They were back at Prewitt's by 7:15. Caroline sat down on the examination bed, and Wade set the 2 ledgers side by side on the desk, and they spent the next 2 hours doing what Caroline did better than almost anyone. They built the case. She read, he questioned. She clarified, he organized the sequence of events into the structure that would need to hold up under cross-examination from whatever lawyers Cross could afford to bring from San Francisco. They worked with the focused, unsentimental efficiency of two people who understand that the time for feeling things fully will come later, but right now, the work is what matters. At 9:30, Caroline set down the page she was reading and said, "It's enough." Wade looked up. "For Briggs," she said. "What we have right now, both ledgers, the land records, the San Francisco transaction. Douglas's testimony, it's enough for a U.S. Marshal to open a federal investigation. Cross can't reach a federal investigation the way he reaches county court." She looked at the ledgers. "We need to get this to Briggs before Cross figures out the ledger is gone." "How long before he notices?" "The cabinet was locked. He didn't know about it, but he has people who watch things, and eventually one of them is going to check that storage room for reasons that have nothing to do with us, and he'll see the cabinet and he'll ask questions." She paused. "A week, maybe less." "I can ride to Carson City tomorrow morning," Wade said. "Be there by noon. If Briggs is in his office." "He needs to come here," Caroline said. "He needs to see the families. He needs to take statements." Written records of what happened to 11 parcels of land are one thing, but 11 people sitting across from a federal marshal saying it out loud is something Cross can't paper over. She held Wade's gaze. "Can Briggs do that? Come to Harlow Creek and take statements without Cross knowing he's here until it's too late to matter?" Wade thought about Henry Briggs. Thought about the two cases they'd worked together, the particular quality of a man who did his job without announcement or theater, because he'd found long ago that quiet was more effective than noise. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly how Briggs works." She nodded once. Then she looked at the photograph in her lap, the one Douglas had kept in the cabinet. She'd picked it up when they were leaving, and she'd been holding it off and on for the last 2 hours without seeming to realize she was doing it. "He kept it at work," she said. She was looking at it now. All 6 years, every time they moved his desk or changed his office, he moved the photograph with it. She touched the edge of it. "He told me once that when the accounts got complicated and the numbers stopped making sense, he'd look at it for a minute, and it helped him think clearly." A long pause. "He said I was the most organized mind he'd ever known, and that being married to me had made him a better bookkeeper." Wade didn't say anything. He understood that she wasn't talking to him exactly. She was saying something out loud that had been inside for a long time, and sometimes that's what a person needs, not a response, just a witness. "He wasn't perfect," she said. "He was frightened, and he made mistakes, and he waited too long to act. But he kept the records. When he was scared and alone and didn't know what to do, he kept the records and he hid them in the one place nobody thought to look, and he left me the key." She set the photograph down carefully on top of the ledger. That was his gift. That was what he could do. "It's going to be enough," Wade said. "What he left you. It's going to be enough to bring Cross down." She looked at him, not with the measuring look this time, with something quieter and more unguarded than that. "You really believe that?" "I really believe that." He held her gaze. "I've built federal cases from less. I've watched men with more reach than Harlan Cross go to prison on documentation exactly like what you're holding." He paused. Cross built his scheme on the assumption that the people he hurt didn't have the tools to fight back. He was right about most of them. He made one mistake. She waited. "He underestimated you," Wade said. He looked at a widow with a bookkeeper's satchel, and he saw a loose end. He didn't see 12 years of expertise and 8 months of careful work and a ledger that reads like testimony, because the man who wrote it understood exactly what he was doing. Something moved in Caroline's face. It was brief, and she controlled it quickly, the way she controlled most things. But it was there, the particular expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that being seen by another person feels almost like a physical sensation. "Douglas saw it," she said quietly. "He said on our first anniversary, he said that the most dangerous person in any room was the one who understood where the money went. He said most people looked at the surface. You look at the books." He was right. She looked down at the ledgers. Then she said without looking up, "Why did you really leave the Pinkertons? Not the version you tell people." He was quiet for a moment. "The town was called Millbrook," he said. "Missouri. Population 212. A railroad company had a right-of-way claim that was disputed. The town said the survey was wrong, the railroad said it wasn't, and I was sent to build the case for the railroad." He turned his hat in his hands. "I built it. I found the documentation they needed. I presented it to the court, and the court ruled for the railroad, and 212 people had 60 days to leave their homes." He paused. 3 weeks after the ruling, I found a survey note in the company's own files that proved the town was right. The original survey had been altered. I brought it to my supervisor, and he told me to put it back where I found it. Caroline was very still. "I put it back," he said. "I went home, and I sat with that for 3 days. And at the end of 3 days I resigned, and I came out here, and I bought a horse station. And I told myself that the way to live with what I'd done was to stay out of other people's business from then on." He set his hat down on the desk. "That's the version I don't tell people." She looked at him. "You've been punishing yourself." "I've been keeping out of the way." "Same thing." She said it without judgment, just precisely the way she read a ledger entry that didn't balance. "Wade, you found me in that barn. You could have called the sheriff and reported an injured woman on your property, and kept it clean and simple, and stayed out of the way." She held his gaze. "You didn't." He didn't have an answer for that. He didn't need one. She wasn't asking for an explanation, she was stating a fact, the same way she'd been stating facts since the first moment she opened her eyes and looked at him in the straw of his barn, and asked if he was real. "There's something I need to ask you," she said. Her voice shifted careful again, the way it got when she was approaching territory she wasn't certain about. "The 11 families. When this is done, when Cross is in custody and the investigation is complete and whatever legal proceedings follow are in process, the land transfers are going to be subject to review. If the fraud is proven, and it will be, those transfers may be reversible." "That's my understanding," Wade said. "It will take time. It will take lawyers and court orders and federal oversight, and it will not be a clean or fast process." She looked at him. "Those families are going to need someone to advocate for them through that process. Someone who understands how federal cases work and how to navigate what comes after the investigation." She paused. "Someone who isn't me, because I am going to be the primary witness, and Briggs is going to need me focused on the case itself." Wade looked at her. "You're asking me to stay involved," he said. "After Briggs comes. After Cross is in custody. I'm asking if you're willing." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about Nora Pelham in 2 rooms on the edge of town with her 16-year-old son doing whatever work he could find. He thought about Edna Birch and 40 acres of good valley land and 11 names that he had memorized without trying, because that was what he did with names attached to injustice. He thought about Millbrook, Missouri, and 212 people, and a survey note he had put back in a file because his supervisor told him to. "Yes," he said, "I'm willing." She exhaled, just slightly, just enough to tell him she hadn't been sure of the answer. Then the door at the top of Pruitt's back stairs opened, and Doc Pruitt came down with his coat half on, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has just heard something from outside that has changed the nature of the evening. "There's a man," Pruitt said without preamble, "standing at the front of my building. He's been there for 20 minutes. He's not Billy Crane." Wade was on his feet before Pruitt finished the sentence. He went to the small high window at the back of the examination room that gave a slanted view of the side street. He looked. The man was standing at the near corner of the building, not at the front door positioned where he could watch both the front entrance and the alley access. He was doing it with the practiced casualness of someone who has done this kind of watching before and has learned to look like he's doing something else. Wade had seen that particular stance in his Pinkerton years. Not on amateurs. He turned back to Caroline. She had already moved. The ledgers were back and the satchel closed, and buckled her hand resting on top of it with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and is waiting for the moment to do it. "He found us faster than a week," she said. "He found us faster than a week," Wade agreed. "What do we do?" He looked at her. He looked at Pruitt. He looked at the satchel under her hand. He ran through the options in the same fast, methodical way he'd run through options in the field for 6 years, stripping out the ones that required things he didn't have, and landing on the one that was available. "Ruth McAllister," he said. "Her store has a back room with a floor access to the building next door. She mentioned it once that her late husband used it for storage. It's not on any building map. Cross doesn't know about it." "You want to move her," Pruitt said. "Tonight." "I want to move the satchel tonight," Wade said. He looked at Caroline. "You stay here. You're the witness, you're more valuable than the evidence. If they get the satchel and you're still able to testify—" "They won't stop at the satchel," Caroline said. Her voice was flat and certain. "Wade, you know what kind of men these are. You said it yourself, a man who arranged a mine shaft collapse does not stop at paperwork." She held his gaze. "I go where the satchel goes." He knew she was right. He'd known it as he was saying it. Pruitt looked between them. Then he took off his coat and handed it to Caroline. "Put this on. It'll change your shape in the dark." He looked at Wade. "There's a side door through the examining room that opens to the back of the property. It comes out 40 yards from the building. Whoever's at the corner can't see it." Wade put his hand briefly on Pruitt's shoulder. "Thank you." "Bring them back in one piece," Pruitt said. "Both of them. I mean that in the singular and the plural." They went out the side door and into the dark Nevada night. Caroline with the satchel against her ribs and Pruitt's coat over her shoulders, and Wade one step ahead and slightly to her left. The way a man positions himself when he's put himself between someone and whatever might be coming. And behind them in his examining room, Doc Pruitt turned up his lamp and sat down in the chair by the front window to give whoever was watching the impression that the building's occupants had settled in for the night. 2 blocks away, in the back room of a dry goods store, Ruth McAllister was about to have unexpected company. And across town in his well-appointed house, Harlan Cross was sitting with a glass of whiskey and the beginning of a feeling he had not had in 3 years of careful, successful operation, the feeling that something was no longer going according to plan. He was right about that. He just didn't know yet how badly wrong it had already gone. Ruth McAllister did not startle when they came through her back door at 9:50 in the evening. She looked at Caroline in Doc Pruitt's coat, and at Wade with his hat low and the particular set to his jaw that meant something had changed, and she said only, "I'll put the kettle on," and moved to do exactly that, because Ruth McAllister was a woman who understood that the most useful thing you can do in a crisis is give people something warm to hold. Caroline sat down at Ruth's back table, with the satchel in her lap, and breathed carefully through the pain in her ribs that she had been not mentioning for the last 2 blocks. Wade stood at the small window that looked out onto the side street and watched for 3 minutes before he was satisfied enough to step back. "There was a man watching Pruitt's building," he said to Ruth. "Not Billy Crane. Someone Cross brought in from outside." Ruth set 3 cups on the table. "How many do you think he has?" "At least 2. Probably more if he's rattled enough to bring in outside men." He sat down. "He's moving faster than I expected." "He's scared," Caroline said. Both of them looked at her. "He's been running this operation for 3 years without anyone pushing back," she said. "He arranged a mine shaft collapse and it was ruled an accident. He foreclosed on 11 families and nobody filed a complaint. He's never had a real problem." She looked at the satchel. "Now he knows I have documentation, and he doesn't know what I have or who I've shown it to, and that uncertainty is worse for a man like Cross than any specific threat. He can't plan against something he can't measure." She paused. "So he's throwing men at it, which means he's making decisions from fear, not strategy." Ruth sat down and looked at Caroline with the expression of a woman who is reassessing something she thought she already understood. "Douglas used to say you were the sharpest mind in any room you walked into." "Douglas was generous." Douglas was accurate, Ruth said simply. Wade looked at Caroline across the table. He had been thinking for the last 2 blocks and the last 3 minutes at the window about Henry Briggs and Carson City and the 40-mile ride between here and there, and about the fact that Cross had men watching now and would notice a rider leaving Harlow Creek at dawn in a way he would not have noticed yesterday. He had been thinking about the window they'd had and the degree to which it had narrowed in the last hour. "I can't ride to Carson City in the morning," he said, "not without Cross knowing." Caroline looked at him. "How else does Briggs get here?" "There's a telegraph office," Ruth said. Both of them turned to her. "Mort Halley runs it. He's been in this town for 15 years and he never liked Cross, not from the beginning. Cross tried to buy him out 2 years ago, and Mort told him what he could do with the offer." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He keeps the office open until 10. It's 8 minutes from here through the back alley." Wade looked at Caroline. "A telegraph brings Briggs here in 24 hours, maybe 36. Cross can't intercept a message that's already been sent." "Mort won't tell Cross what was in it," Ruth said. "I'd stake this store on that." "He'll know a message was sent," Wade said. "He'll know the direction. By the time he does anything about it, Briggs will already be on his way." Caroline set the satchel on the table. "Go. I'll stay here with Ruth." He looked at her. He had a particular reluctance to leave her that he recognized as new. 4 days ago, he hadn't known her name, and now the idea of putting 40 yards between them felt like a calculation that needed to be checked twice. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said. "I know." She held his gaze for a moment. "Wade, tell Briggs about Douglas, not just the ledger. Tell him who Douglas was, and what he did, and why he did it." She paused. "I need Briggs to understand that this case has names attached to it, not just numbers." He picked up his hat. "I'll tell him." Mort Halley was a thin, weathered man of 60, who had the economical quality of someone who has spent a career translating human language into code and back again and has developed a profound respect for brevity. He looked at Wade across the telegraph counter, read the message Wade had written on the slip of paper, and read it again. Then he looked up. "Henry Briggs," he said. "You know him." "I know of him. Honest man." Mort glanced at the message again. "This is about Cross." It was not a question. "If anyone asks what was in this message," Wade said, "you didn't read it." "I never read messages," Mort said, and sat down at his key and began to send. Wade was back at Ruth's in 17 minutes. Caroline was at the table with both ledgers open in front of her, and Ruth was sitting across from her, making notes on a piece of paper in her own handwriting, and they looked like 2 women who had been doing exactly this, working systematically, without wasted motion, for considerably longer than 17 minutes. He stopped in the doorway and looked at them. "What is this?" he said. "Witness list," Ruth said without looking up. "Every family that was foreclosed on, and who in this county knew about it, and when, and what they said, and who they said it to." She wrote another line. "If Briggs needs corroborating statements from people who aren't Caroline, he's going to need names, and he's going to need to know who can be approached without Cross finding out. I know this county. I know who talks and who doesn't, and who has been waiting for someone to ask." 3 families, Caroline said also without looking up. "Kept their own records. Payment receipts, correspondence with the banknotes about conversations with Cross's agents. They didn't know the records mattered. They kept them because that's what careful people do." She looked up at Wade. "Ruth knew. She's known for months." Wade looked at Ruth. "Why didn't you—" "I had nothing to bring it to." Ruth's voice was direct and unapologetic. "I had suspicions and community knowledge and no documentation. Without documentation, a woman going to the county sheriff to accuse the most powerful banker in the territory is not a witness. She's a problem to be managed." She set down her pencil. "Caroline had the documentation. I was waiting for her to be ready." A pause. I was waiting for her to find someone she could trust to stand beside her. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "The telegraph is sent," Wade said. "Briggs will have it within the hour. If he moves tomorrow morning, he'll be in Harlow Creek by Thursday afternoon at the latest." "Then we have 36 hours, Caroline said. She looked at the ledgers and then at Ruth's list. "We use them." They worked until midnight. Ruth's list grew to 22 names, not just the foreclosed families, but neighbors' merchants, the clerk at the land office, who had processed the fraudulent transfers and had done so without understanding what he was processing. 2 ranch hands who had been present at conversations they hadn't been meant to remember. The community knowledge of 3 years of wrong things quietly done assembled in Ruth McAllister's back room by lamplight while the town slept. At midnight, Ruth made Caroline stop. "You're pale," she said in the tone that was not a suggestion. "You've been pale for the last hour, and you're breathing in that way that means the ribs are bad, and you're not saying so." "The ribs are manageable," Caroline said. "The ribs were manageable an hour ago. Now they're worse, and you're going to make them worse still if you don't sleep." Ruth stood up and looked at Wade with the expression of a woman appointing responsibility. "The back bedroom. There's a lock on the door. She sleeps. You keep watch." Caroline started to object. Ruth looked at her with the particular look of a woman who has raised people and outlasted a husband and run a business alone and has no patience left for unnecessary arguing, and Caroline closed her mouth. 4 hours, Caroline said. "Then I'm back up." 6, Ruth said. 5. 5 and a half, and not 1 minute less. Ruth picked up the lamp. "I've been agreeable about a great many things tonight. I'm not being agreeable about this." Wade stayed in the kitchen. He sat with his back to the wall where he could see both the back door and the hallway, and he thought about Henry Briggs and what Briggs would do when he arrived and how the next 36 hours needed to go in order for this to work. He thought about Cross and the men Cross had watching and the degree to which Cross was currently calculating the cold patient calculation of a man who has operated without consequences for long enough that he can't quite believe consequences are actually coming, but is smart enough to prepare for the possibility. He thought about Douglas Aldridge writing in careful, precise handwriting in a locked cabinet in a bank storage room, recording things that frightened him because recording things was the only form of courage available to him, and leaving the key with his wife. He thought about Sarah. He didn't think about Sarah often in any specific way. He thought about her the way you think about weather that changed everything, as a condition rather than a memory. But tonight, in Ruth McAllister's kitchen at 1 in the morning, with a case built on 12 years of bookkeeping expertise and a dead man's testimony, he thought about her specifically. He thought about the particular quality she'd had of going directly at the thing that needed to be done without ceremony or delay, the way Caroline went directly at things. He thought about how Sarah would have looked at Caroline Aldridge and what she would have said, and he was fairly certain it would have been something like, "Now there's a woman who knows where the money went." He was still thinking when he heard it, not from outside, not from the street, but from somewhere above him. The sound of a footstep on the roof of the building, careful and deliberate, the kind of footstep that is trying very hard not to be a footstep. He was on his feet before the sound finished. He went to the hallway and knocked twice on the back bedroom door, low and quiet. "Caroline." The door opened in 4 seconds, which told him she hadn't been asleep, or hadn't been fully asleep, or was the kind of person who came awake completely and immediately. She looked at his face and read it. "Someone's on the roof," he said. She had the satchel in her hand before he finished the sentence. He went to Ruth's door and knocked, and Ruth appeared in 6 seconds fully dressed, which meant she hadn't been asleep either. He told her with 2 words and a gesture what was happening, and she nodded once and went to the locked drawer under her counter and produced a shotgun that she held with the practiced ease of a woman who had used one before and was not sentimental about it. "Back door," she said. "The man on the roof is trying to find out how many people are in the building," Wade said low and quick. "He's not moving yet. They'll want to know the layout before they come in." He looked at Ruth. Is there another way out? Floor panel in the back bedroom. Goes to the building next door. I told you about it. It comes up in the storeroom. She was already moving. The storeroom has a street exit on the east side. Go, Wade said to Caroline. Take the satchel. Ruth goes with you. And you, Caroline said. I'll be behind you in 2 minutes. She held his gaze for 1 second. Not the measuring look. Something more direct than that, more urgent. Something she pressed down before it could become anything specific. 2 minutes, she said. Not 3. They went through the floor panel. Wade heard the soft sounds of them moving through the space below, and then silence as they cleared it, and then he turned back to Ruth's kitchen and stood very still and listened to the roof. 1 man above. The footsteps had stopped, which meant he was positioned and waiting for a signal from wherever his partner was. Which meant the partner was either at the front of the building or at the east exit, the same east exit Ruth had just sent Caroline toward. He moved fast. He went back down through the floor panel and through the dark connecting space and came up into the storeroom in time to hear from the far side of the storeroom door a voice say something in a low tone that was answered by a second voice closer to the street exit. 2 men. Front and east. The roof man was the third. He put his hand on Caroline's arm in the dark, and she went still. He leaned close to her ear. East exit is covered. Stay here. He felt her hand close briefly on his wrist, not stopping him, just acknowledging, and then he moved to the storeroom door and opened it by the width of 1 inch and looked through. The man at the east exit had his back to the storeroom. He was watching the street, not the building, which was the mistake of a man who expected his target to come from a particular direction, and had stopped considering other possibilities. Wade came through the door quietly, crossed the distance in 4 steps, and had the man's arm behind his back and his face against the wall before he could turn around. The man made 1 sharp sound and then went still when he felt Wade's hand close on the back of his collar. Who sent you? Wade said. Quiet, direct, nothing. I know who sent you, Wade said. I'm asking because I want to know whether you understand what you're involved in. There's a federal marshal coming to this county in 36 hours. Whatever Cross is paying you is not enough for what happens when Briggs gets here. Not for this. A pause. I've got a family, the man said. His voice was in his 30s, maybe younger. Not the voice of someone who'd been doing this for long. He said it was just watching. He said nobody was going to get hurt. Nobody's going to get hurt tonight, Wade said. Tell me how many men he has watching this street. A pause. 3. Me Vic on the roof, and Crane at the front. Billy Crane. Wade tightened his grip slightly. Where is Cross right now? His house. He's waiting for us to report back. What were you told to do if you found her? The pause this time was longer and had a different quality. Bring the bag, the man said. Just the bag. He said, just get the bag. He was lying, or he was telling himself it was the truth. Wade couldn't be certain which, and it didn't change what needed to happen next. Here's what you're going to do, Wade said. You're going to walk back to wherever you came from, and you're going to tell Cross you found nothing. Nobody at Prewitt's, nobody at the McAllister store, no bag. You're going to say the woman is gone and the trail is cold. You understand me. He won't believe that. He doesn't need to believe it for long, just until tomorrow night. Wade released him slowly. And then, you're going to go home to your family, and you're going to stay there because when the marshal gets here and the questions start, the men who weren't present when things happened are considerably better positioned than the men who were. The man stood with his back to Wade for a moment. His shoulders had the particular set of someone making a decision they hadn't expected to have to make tonight. Then he walked away, around the corner toward the front of the building without looking back. Wade went back into the storeroom. Caroline and Ruth were exactly where he'd left them. Ruth had the shotgun, and Caroline had the satchel, and they had both clearly heard enough through the door to understand the shape of what had happened. You let him go, Caroline said. He's going to tell Cross the trail is cold. Cross won't believe it. No. Wade agreed. But it buys us hours, and right now hours are what we need. He looked at them both. We can't stay here. Cross knows about Pruitt's, and he knows about Ruth's, or he will shortly. We need somewhere he hasn't thought to look. Ruth was already thinking. He could see it. Nora Pelham, she said. Wade looked at her. 2 rooms above the laundry on Cutter Street, Ruth said. She's one of the 11. Cross has no reason to watch her specifically. She's already lost her land. She's not a threat in his calculation. Her rooms are not connected to either of you. She paused. And she's been waiting 3 years for someone to do something about what happened to her. She will let you through her door. Caroline looked at Wade. We go now, he said, while Crane and the roofman are still waiting for their partner to report back. They went through the back of the storeroom, through an alley across a side street that was empty, in the way that small-town streets are empty past midnight, fully, completely, with the kind of silence that makes every footstep feel loud. Caroline moved steadily. Wade stayed to her left, 1 step behind, and slightly angled the position he'd taken without thinking about it 2 nights ago, and had not moved from since. Ruth knocked at a door on Cutter Street. It opened in a long moment, and a woman stood in the frame, mid-40s, worn but upright, with the eyes of someone who has been expecting bad news for long enough that its absence has become the thing she doesn't trust. Ruth said only, Nora, we need an hour, maybe more. Nora Pelham looked at Ruth, then at Caroline, then at Wade, then at the satchel. She stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. She made them sit. She made coffee without being asked. And then she sat down across from Caroline and folded her hands on the table and said in the direct way of a woman who has nothing left to protect, by being indirect, Is this about the land? Yes, Caroline said. Douglas Aldrich's wife. Yes. Nora was quiet for a moment. Douglas was a good man, she said finally. He came to see me once about 8 months before he died. He said he wanted to understand what the foreclosure had felt like from our side. He sat at this table for an hour, and he listened, and he wrote things down. She looked at her hands. I thought he was just doing bank business. I thought he was building the case for why the foreclosure was correct. A pause. He wasn't, was he? No, Caroline said. He was building something else entirely. Nora looked up. Her eyes went to the satchel and stayed there for a moment, and then she looked at Caroline's face, with the expression of a woman who is calculating very fast how much to hope and how much to guard against hoping. Can you fix it? She said. What was done to us? Can it actually be fixed? Caroline didn't look away. I believe it can be. The transfers were fraudulent. If the fraud is proven in federal court and we have the documentation to prove it, the transfers are subject to reversal. The land may come back. The room was very still. May, Nora said. May. Caroline said honestly, I won't tell you it's certain. I won't tell you it's fast. But I will tell you that we have a federal marshal coming to this county in 36 hours, and we have documentation that reads like testimony, and we have a man who has made the mistake of believing he was untouchable for so long that he's stopped being careful. She held Nora's gaze. We have a real case. That I can promise you. Nora Pelham looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Wade, with the particular measuring quality that women in difficult circumstances develop, the look that goes past the surface of a man and checks what's underneath. You were the Pinkerton, she said. People say you're honest. People are occasionally right, Wade said. Something shifted in Nora's face. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. All right, she said. She stood up. You'll stay here tonight, both of you. I've got a sofa that's decent and a chair that's better than it looks, and nobody in this building knows anyone's business but their own." She picked up her cup. "And in the morning, you're going to tell me what I can do, because I've been sitting in 2 rooms for 3 years, waiting for someone to ask." Wade looked at Caroline. Caroline looked at Nora Pelham, and then at the satchel, and then at the list of 22 names that Ruth had tucked inside the front cover of the brown ledger before they left. 22 names, 11 families, 2 dead men, 1 woman who had kept the books for 8 months alone. And somewhere in Carson City, Henry Briggs was reading a telegraph message that was about to bring him 40 miles in the direction of the most significant case of fraud the Nevada Territory had seen in a decade. 36 hours. Cross was awake across town in his well-appointed house recalculating. Wade knew it the way he knew weather in his bones from experience, from 6 years of learning to read the shape of how men moved when they were afraid. But Cross was calculating against what he knew. And what he knew was already 36 hours out of date. Henry Briggs arrived on Thursday afternoon, not from the main road into Harlow Creek, but from the eastern trail that came in behind the feed store, which told Wade 2 things immediately: that Briggs had read the telegraph message carefully enough to understand that the main road was not advisable, and that Briggs was exactly the same man he'd been 4 years ago when they'd worked 2 cases together, and Wade had walked away from the job, but not from the respect. He was a broad, unhurried man of 50, with a marshal's badge he wore inside his jacket rather than on it, which was the habit of a man who had learned that announcing yourself too early closes doors that would otherwise stay open. He shook Wade's hand in the alley behind Nora Pelham's building and looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has traveled 40 miles on short notice and is not interested in preamble. "Your telegraph said federal fraud and possible criminal homicide," Briggs said. "Those are not small words." "No," Wade agreed. "They're not." "You'd better show me what you've got." They went inside. Nora had cleared her kitchen table entirely and covered it with a cloth, and Caroline had laid both ledgers and the land records, and Ruth's list of 22 names across it, in the order that built the case most clearly, from beginning to end the sequence of a woman who had spent 8 months organizing this moment in her head and knew exactly how it needed to land. Briggs sat down. He looked at the table. He looked at Caroline. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "you assembled this." "My husband assembled most of it," she said. "I organized it and verified it and added what he couldn't finish." Briggs picked up the brown ledger. He opened it. He read for 4 minutes without saying anything, which was longer than most men took to respond to something significant, and told Wade that Briggs was reading every word, rather than skimming for highlights. Then he set it down and looked at Caroline directly. "Your husband understood what he was documenting," he said. "This reads like a deposition." "He was a careful man," Caroline said. "He understood that clarity mattered more than protection by the end." "The mine shaft," Briggs said, "is in the last section of that ledger. He records the conversation with Cross 4 days before the inspection. He records the names of the other 2 men who were present at that conversation." She paused. "Both of those men died in the same shaft collapse." Briggs was very still for a moment. "You believe this was arranged?" "I don't believe it," Caroline said. "I can demonstrate it." The 3rd section of the Satchel Ledger contains the bank's internal correspondence about the mine loan portfolio. Cross directed Douglas to conduct the inspection himself, rather than using the bank's standard contracted inspector. That deviation from standard procedure is documented in 3 separate internal memos. She reached across the table and opened the Satchel Ledger to the marked page. The contracted inspector was used for every other mine inspection in the bank's portfolio that year. My husband was sent specifically. Specifically, and alone. The kitchen was very quiet. Briggs looked at Wade. "You verified this independently." "I cross-referenced the land records and the San Francisco transaction," Wade said. "The parcel Cross sold directly to the Pacific Northern Line is documented in the Territorial Recorder's Office. The connection to the railroad is not theoretical, it's on file. I have a contact in the Recorder's Office who can produce a certified copy within 24 hours. Briggs closed the ledger. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at the full spread of documentation in front of him, with the expression of a man doing two things at once, absorbing what he's seeing and building the procedural framework for what comes next. Harlan Cross has relationships in this county's court system, he said. 2 judges that I've identified, Caroline said. Their names are in Ruth McAllister's list, with the specific instances of rulings that benefited Cross's operation. I can't prove payment, but the pattern is demonstrable. You won't need to prove payment for the initial arrest, Briggs said. Federal fraud and criminal homicide are outside county jurisdiction, regardless of what Cross has bought locally. He picked up Ruth's list and scanned it. These families, can they be reached discreetly in the next 12 hours? Ruth McAllister can reach them, Wade said. She knows every one of them, and she knows how to do it without drawing attention. I need written statements, not elaborate, just signed accounts of the foreclosure process, the specific conversations with bank agents, the paperwork they were shown. He set the list down. Even 2 or 3 solid statements support the ledger evidence enough to make the arrest unchallengeable. He looked at Caroline. I'm going to need you to be available for a formal deposition. Today, before I move on Cross. If anything happens between now and the arrest. Nothing is going to happen to me, Caroline said. Mrs. Aldridge. Briggs said it with the careful directness of a man who has seen things go wrong in the final hours of more cases than he could count. I don't say that to alarm you. I say it because a deposition on record protects the case regardless of what Cross attempts between now and custody. It's the procedural foundation. He held her gaze. It also means that whatever he does next, it doesn't matter. The case exists independently of you. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. All right. Good. He stood up. I'm going to need 3 hours. Mrs. Aldridge, we start the deposition now. Mr. Calloway, I need you to get to that contact at the recorder's office and have the certified copy of the San Francisco transaction in my hand before 5 o'clock. He looked at Nora, who was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, having listened to all of it with her arms folded and her expression unreadable. Mrs. Pelham, are you willing to give a statement? Nora unfolded her arms. I've been willing to give a statement for 3 years, she said. I just needed someone with a badge who wasn't in Cross's pocket to ask for one. Briggs almost smiled. Then let's get to work. Wade spent 3 hours moving through Harlow Creek in the careful, indirect way of a man who has been watched and knows it and has decided to use that knowledge rather than fight it. He went to the recorder's office through the back entrance that his contact, a young clerk named Paul Greer, who had been quietly furious about the fraudulent transfers for 2 years and had been waiting for someone to do something about it, left unlocked for him. Paul had the certified copy ready in 40 minutes, which meant he'd started preparing it the moment Wade sent word that morning, which meant Paul Greer had been waiting for this moment with the particular readiness of someone who has rehearsed it. He had 2 other stops. The first was to Decker Price, the young bank clerk Caroline had mentioned in Doc Pruitt's examining room on the first night, the one with the conscience that hadn't been fully purchased. Wade found him at his boarding house on his lunch break, sitting on the front steps with a sandwich he wasn't eating, and sat down beside him and said without any lead-up, "There's a federal marshal in Harlow Creek right now taking depositions. He's going to arrest Harlan Cross before this evening. I need to know if you're going to be on the right side of that or the wrong side." Decker Price was 23 years old, and he had the face of someone who had been carrying something heavy for longer than he'd been equipped to carry it. He set down the sandwich. He looked at his hands. He said, "I knew something was wrong. I knew it for a year. I told myself it wasn't my business." "I know that feeling," Wade said. Decker looked at him. "What do I do? You walk with me right now to Nora Pelham's rooms on Cutter Street, and you give Henry Briggs a statement about every irregular transaction you witnessed, and every instruction from Cross that didn't make sense to you, and every document you were asked to process that felt wrong when you processed it." Wade stood up. "And then you go home, and you stay there. And when the questions come, and they will come, You tell the truth the same way you just told it to me." Decker Price stood up and left the sandwich on the step and walked with Wade to Cutter Street without saying another word, which was the most useful thing he could have done. The second stop was Ruth McAllister's store. Ruth had spent the morning the way she spent most things, efficiently and without fanfare, moving through her network of relationships with the quiet purposefulness of a woman who has been trusted with people's business for 20 years and has never once abused that trust. She had 3 signed statements by noon and 2 more promised for the afternoon, and she handed them to Wade with the manner of someone completing a transaction that had been a long time in preparation. "Edna Birch cried when I told her," Ruth said. "Not from sadness. She said she'd stopped believing anyone was going to do anything about this, and she was crying because she'd been wrong to stop believing." She paused. "I told her that was Caroline Aldridge's doing. She said to tell Mrs. Aldridge that she was going to name her next colt after her." Wade took the statements. "Thank you, Ruth." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when Cross is in handcuffs and those families have their land back." She straightened something on the counter that didn't need straightening. "And tell that marshal that if he needs someone to describe the general sentiment of this county toward Harlan Cross over the past 3 years, I am available, and I have a very good memory." He was back at Nora's before 5. He laid the certified copy and the statements on the table in front of Briggs, and Briggs looked at the certified copy for a long moment and then placed it on top of the deposition he'd spent 3 hours building with Caroline and said quietly, "That's the case." "That's the case," Wade agreed. "I'll move on Cross at 6. Briggs began organizing the documents with the deliberate care of a man who has done this many times and understands that the paperwork is not the bureaucratic inconvenience that follows the real work. The paperwork is the real work. "I want you and Mrs. Aldridge to stay here until I send word. Cross may have men in positions I don't know about yet, and I don't want either of you on the street when I make the approach." "Understood." Caroline was sitting at the table. She had been sitting quietly for the last hour after the deposition finished, in the way she sat when she was thinking, fully still, internally occupied, not absent, but present in a different direction. She looked up at Wade when he came back and read his face the way she always did. "It's enough," she said. "It's enough," he confirmed. She let out a breath, slow and controlled the way all her breaths were controlled, but this one had something different in it, something that had been held for 8 months and was only now beginning to release. "He's going to fight it," she said, "even in custody. His lawyers from San Francisco. We'll have a federal fraud case, a criminal homicide investigation, and documented evidence of judicial corruption waiting for them when they arrive," Briggs said without looking up from his paperwork. "Men like Cross fight what they think they can win. When they see the full shape of what's in front of them, the smart ones make different calculations." He closed the folder. "Cross is smart. He'll make different calculations." At 6:15, Wade heard it, not from the window, not from outside, but from the particular quality of quiet that falls over a small town when something significant is happening on its main street. The kind of quiet that spreads from person to person as people stop what they're doing and look, and the silence moves outward from a single point. He went to the window. He could see the edge of it from the angle he had Briggs and 2 deputies he'd brought from Carson City moving toward the Carson Commercial Bank, with the unhurried certainty of men who are doing something that cannot be undone once started, and who have made their peace with that. The door of the bank opened. Cross came out, not because he'd been dragged out, but because he was smart enough to understand that the calculation had changed, and he was doing it with the last of his composure intact. The smooth, assembled expression of a man trying to look like this was something he had chosen. But Wade had been watching Harlan Cross for 4 days now, and he knew what composed looked like on that face, and he knew what it looked like when it was being performed. And what was on Cross's face as Briggs spoke to him in the street was the performance version. Underneath it was something older and colder, the expression of a man who has understood that he has lost not just tactically, but completely, and is now calculating only how bad the losing is going to be. Sheriff Dodd appeared at the edge of the street. He looked at Briggs. He looked at Cross. He did the calculation that a man does when he realizes the structure that has been supporting him has just been removed, and he took a step back and stayed where he was and said nothing, which was the only sensible thing available to him. Caroline appeared at Wade's shoulder. He hadn't heard her move. She stood beside him and looked out the window and watched Briggs put his hand on Cross's arm and turn him toward the street, and her face did something complicated and careful, and finally, in the last moment before she looked away, something very simple. The expression of a person watching a wrong thing be named wrong in front of witnesses. Which is the thing she had told him in Doc Pruitt's examining room that she needed, and which was now actually happening. "Is it enough?" she said quietly. "Not about the case this time." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She kept her eyes on the window for a moment. "For Douglas. Does it feel like enough?" He understood what she was asking. It was not a legal question. "I don't know if enough is the right word," he said carefully. "I think it's true. And I think true is what matters to Douglas more than enough." He paused. He kept the books because he believed the truth recorded clearly was worth something. He was right. It was worth everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He would have liked you." Wade didn't answer that. He didn't need to. She wasn't looking for a response. She was placing something the way you place a thing you've been carrying into a location that is finally appropriate for it. Nora Pelham made supper. She did it without asking, without ceremony, in the straightforward way of a woman who feeds people. Because feeding people is what she knows how to do when everything else is uncertain, and the smell of it brought Ruth McAllister through the door at 7:30, because Ruth had heard it from the street, and she came in carrying a pie that she had clearly made earlier in anticipation of this moment, and had not mentioned to anyone because Ruth McAllister did not announce what she intended to do. She simply did it. Doc Pruitt arrived at 8 with his bag over his shoulder and the look of a man who has been waiting all day for permission to stop worrying and has not yet received it, and he examined Caroline's ribs and her shoulder and her fever-free forehead with the focused irritability of a doctor who finds that his patient is in better condition than he had a right to expect, and he said, "The ribs are going to hurt for another 2 weeks. Don't lift anything. Don't reach above your head. Don't do anything that could reasonably be called strenuous." He looked at her over his spectacles. "I expect you to follow precisely none of those instructions." "I'll follow some of them," Caroline said. "That's better than your average," Pruitt said, and sat down and accepted a cup of coffee from Nora and a slice of Ruth's pie, and the kitchen filled with the particular quality of warmth that comes when people who have been through something hard together sit down at the same table and breathe for the first time. Decker Price appeared at the door at 8:30, hat in hand, looking like a man who isn't sure if he's welcome at a gathering. He's only partly earned the right to attend. Nora saw him before anyone else and opened the door wider and said, "Sit down, Decker," in a tone that settled the question, and he sat, and Ruth handed him pie, and the young man ate it with the particular gratitude of someone who has done something right after a long time of not doing it, and is still not entirely sure how to live in the relief of that. Briggs came by at 9. He declined the pie and the coffee, but he stood in the doorway and reported in the brief, factual way of his profession. Cross was in custody. The bank's records had been formally seized. The 2 men who had been watching Pruitt's building had been identified and detained, and the county commissioner, who had been at a very uncomfortable dinner meeting when the arrest occurred, was currently cooperating with a speed that Briggs described only as enthusiastic. "The San Francisco lawyers will arrive within a week," he said. "The federal case will take time. These things always do." He looked at Caroline. "But the framework is established. The evidence is in federal custody. Whatever Cross's lawyers do from this point, they're doing it against documentation that cannot be altered or suppressed." He paused. "Your husband's ledger is going to be the center of the criminal homicide case. His name is going to be on record as the primary source." He held her gaze. "He's going to be the reason this holds." Caroline was very still for a moment. "Thank you for telling me that." Briggs nodded once and left. The kitchen went quiet in the way that a kitchen goes quiet when the significant thing has finally been said and everyone is absorbing it. Nora was looking at her hands. Ruth was looking at Caroline. Decker was looking at his pie. And Wade was looking at the table and thinking about 11 names, and 2 dead men, and a 40-mile ride, and a telegraph message, and a woman who had been lying in his barn in August, still holding on to the one thing she had refused to give up. "What happens to the land?" Nora said. She asked it quietly, without the desperate urgency it might have had before tonight, but she asked it because it was the question that everything had been building toward for her, and she needed to hear it said. "It will take federal court review," Caroline said. Briggs explained the process. "It won't be fast. But the transfers were fraudulent, and the documentation proves it, and when the review is complete, the transfers are reversible." She looked at Nora directly. "It is going to come back." Nora Pelham pressed her lips together. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she looked back at the table and she said, "My husband cleared that land by hand. Took him 6 years. He died before we lost it." She paused. "He never knew we were going to lose it. I used to think that was the cruelest thing, that he died thinking it was safe." She was quiet for a moment. "I think now maybe it was a mercy." Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Later, when Nora and Ruth had gone, and Decker had slipped out, and Doc Pruitt had made Caroline promise for the 4th time to come to his office in the morning, Wade and Caroline sat at the kitchen table, in the particular quiet that follows the end of something enormous. The lamp was low. The pie was mostly gone. The satchel was on the chair beside Caroline, and for the first time since Wade had seen it pressed against her ribs in his barn, it had the quality of something that had completed its purpose, not a burden she was carrying, but a thing she had delivered. "What do you do now?" Wade said. "After the depositions and the court process and all of it." She looked at the satchel. "I have 12 years of bookkeeping expertise," she said. "I have a reputation in this territory that is at this moment somewhat unusual, and I have a fairly specific understanding of how fraudulent financial operations are constructed and concealed." She looked at him. "There are probably other counties with other Harlan crosses. Men who built their schemes on the assumption that the people they hurt didn't have the tools to fight back." He looked at her. "I'm going to find them," she said simply. "One county at a time. I'm going to look at the books." He sat with that for a moment. He thought about Missouri and Millbrook and 212 people and a survey note he had put back in a file because someone told him to. He thought about 4 years of horse station and north fence lines and mornings he ate standing at a counter because sitting at a table alone had a quality he couldn't make peace with. "You're going to need someone who knows how federal cases are built," he said. "Someone who knows the procedural side and the field work and how to approach a man like Briggs when the time comes." She looked at him. Not the measuring look. The direct one. The one that had been there since the barn, since the first moment, looking at him without calculation or performance, the way she looked at everything she decided to trust. "I'm going to need exactly that," she said. Outside Harlow Creek settled into its Thursday night ordinary and changed in equal measure, the same streets and the same buildings and the same people going about their business. Except that the man who had been running this county from behind a bank desk for 3 years was in federal custody, and 11 families were going to sleep tonight in the knowledge that someone had looked at the books, and that the books had told the truth, and that the truth had mattered enough to act on. In the morning, Caroline Aldridge would walk into Doc Pruitt's office on her own 2 feet, with the satchel over her shoulder and the second ledger under her arm, and she would sit down across from Henry Briggs and spend 4 hours giving the most detailed and precise deposition he had taken in 30 years of federal work. And Briggs would say afterward to no one in particular that he had never seen a witness who understood so clearly the difference between what she felt and what she could prove, and who gave him only the latter without being asked. But that was the morning. Tonight in Nora Pelham's kitchen, the lamp burned low, and 2 people sat at a table that had held the weight of 11 families, and 2 dead men, and 8 months of a woman working alone, and the work was done, and the truth was in federal hands, and Douglas Aldridge's careful handwriting was on record in a place where it could never be suppressed again. A man had ridden out to check on a horse and had heard something in a barn that stopped him cold. and he had made the choice, the same choice that matters in the end. The only one that ever really does, to stop walking and look. And everything that followed traced back to that single moment of turning toward rather than away. Caroline reached across the table and set her hand briefly on top of Wade's, light and deliberate, the gesture of a woman who does not make gestures carelessly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Some debts are paid, not in words, but in the fact of still being at the table, alive, unbroken, holding the truth in both hands. And that in the end was exactly what Douglas Aldrich had always believed, that a record kept faithfully and carried far enough would find its way to the light, and that the woman who carried it would not stop until it did. He had been right about that. He had been right about everything that mattered. And in a federal custody cell in Harlow Creek, Nevada, on a Thursday night in August of 1878, Harlan Cross sat with his lawyers and his calculations, and the slowly settling understanding that the woman he had left for dead in a barn had not died, had not stopped, had not surrendered a single page of what she carried, and that the books, kept faithfully and read aloud at last in front of witnesses, had already said everything that needed to be said, 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 that needed to be said.